Have you ever wondered what two French male philosophers have to say about breasts? Well, I've got something interesting for you today. Not entirely facetiously am I going to be discussing Deleuze and Guattari on the difference between materiality and affect in their book Anti-Oedipus. This is the first of their two kind of seminal works they did together, Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. And in Anti-Oedipus, they're more singularly concerned with redefining psychoanalysis into the discipline that they call schizoanalysis, in which they take some very interesting things about the psychology and philosophy of schizophrenia and its implications for how we can think about a more radical mode of thought. And one of the things that kind of stands in the foreground of what they're doing in Anti-Oedipus is an ontological primacy of desire and of affect. They famously discuss desiring machines here. And desiring machines, I've done lectures on desiring machines before, but desiring machines are productive organs of desire. So, for example, I am a desiring machine insofar as I am driven by my desires to do things. And Lacan, for example, will say that my desires point outside of me because they point to something which I lack, and my desire tries to fulfill that lack. Thus, desire has an essentially negative function. But Deleuze and Guattari actually turn that on its head and say that desiring is not negative, but productive. That desire actually constitutes the being of the subject, not by pointing to my lack, but by creating the force which allows me to live in the world, which is that I'm a thing which does things. Heidegger says at various points in Being in Time that we are what we do. That what it means to be Dasein, this unique mode of human existence, is to be uniquely implicated in the world through the way that I throw myself into and involve myself in the world with my actions. And Deleuze and Guattari are concerned with how do our actions implicate what it means to be me, this subject that I can attach a name to. And in particular, they want to discuss an ontological differentiation that I don't think is often made. And they put it so brilliantly here with the very funny and idiosyncratic example of breasts. In the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, where they're discussing desiring machines, they want to go against a traditional philosophical presupposition, which is that emotions, feelings, ideas, and concepts are representations. Their anti-representationalist framework will remain throughout their work. It's been very central in, for example, Deleuze's work, Difference and Repetition, one of the first really big works that he produced. And basically, the traditional philosophical assumption is that, for example, when I see a chair, I make a mental representation in my head which corresponds to some extent or represents the chair independent of my mind, outside of my mind. So there's a subject-object dualism going on here, where I have the subject, which is trying to adequately represent and correspond his inner thought content to the world, and then I have the world out there which doesn't care for my thoughts whatsoever, and it just stands there innocently. Now, Deleuze and Guattari want to challenge this a little bit, because there becomes a bit of a muddling of the waters when we have to think about what allows the world to be something capable of being lived in. This is one of the big concerns of Heidegger in Being in Time. What makes the world something that we can actually inhabit and problematize through our goals, our intentions, our values, our plans, for example? And here's the passage that I want to focus on, and I'm going to be spending this lecture picking apart this passage to give you a microcosm point of what's going on in Deleuze and Guattari's project in general. They say that nothing here is representative. Rather, it is all life and lived experience. The actual lived emotion of having breasts does not resemble breasts. It does not represent them any more than a predestined zone in the egg resembles the organ that it is going to be stimulated to produce within itself. Nothing but bands of intensity, potentials, thresholds, and gradients. A harrowing, emotionally overwhelming experience, which brings the schizo as close as possible to matter, to a burning, living center of matter. And they quote Artaud here. This emotion, situated outside of the particular point where the mind is searching for it. One's entire soul flows into this emotion that makes the mind aware of the terribly disturbing sound of matter and passes through its white-hot flame. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here. This is a very emblematic case of how Deleuze and Guattari like to write. They're mixing up lots of different quotes and ideas and analogies and examples and whatnot. But the key thing that we want to focus on is what are their problems with representation or representationalist thinking, or this is also called the correspondence theory of truth. Well, they say quite simply that the lived emotion of having breasts does not resemble the breasts. Now, what does this mean? What are they trying to say here? Well, you had a strain in philosophy, especially in American philosophy, called logical positivism. And logical positivism was concerned with empirical verification. They were asking questions such as, how do our ideas come to make sense? Sense being this kernel of identity that allows something to express something. So for example, when I say the word book carries some kind of sense, which allows this thing that I'm holding in my hand to light up as being related to the word book. Now, the traditional assumption is that this is because the word book somehow represents this thing that I'm holding by standing in for a concept which in some way grasps the generalities of what it means to be a book. For example, the concept book holds within it, has a spine, has a cover, has pages, is bound together, has words in it, all these other things. And that's their traditional assumption, that laden within the concept book, which is invoked and implicated in the signifier book, this word that I use to talk about this thing, there is something that represents or corresponds to the reality of the book that allows the word to actually mean something and come to carry sense. And the logical positivists were concerned with the fact that there seems to be some words which have no referent, and for the logical positivists, thus no sense. Because for them, meaning or sense is directly tied to the ability for us to empirically verify that sense. So for example, if I have this word book, the question is, can I look into the empirical world and nail down the referent of the word book in the sentence in which I'm using it? And if we can, then it's been empirically verified, and thus because it has been empirically verified, the word can have sense. But if I say, for example, heebie-jeebie, the logical positivist might be tempted to say, and in fact will say, that that has no sense, no meaning. It is nonsensical because there is no empirical referent to which the word heebie-jeebie refers. Now, I could of course come back and say, well, I get the heebie-jeebies sometimes, and I can tell you the contexts in which I get the heebie-jeebies and what sort of affects we might associate with this word, the heebie-jeebies. And the logical positivist is in a tricky situation where you have some that will say, we cannot suitably narrow down the empirical referent of the sorts of emotions that go along with the heebie-jeebies, or really, in actual reality, the neurological facts going on in the brain that are associated with the feeling of having the heebie-jeebies. If we can't do that, then we just have to say that heebie-jeebies is a word that we need to do away with. It means nothing. And this is a tricky situation because how are we able to use this word if it has no meaning? Well, this is the problem of representationalist thinking. Because for the logical positivist, any emotion or affect, for example, the feeling of anxiety or fear or disgust or awe, all of these have meaning or sense solely insofar as the word or concept can be correlated to the physical, chemical, physiological, physical facts of the body that correlate with what I take to be that feeling. So, for example, say you have 10 people who all experience anxiety in front of certain stimuli. Well, the logical positivist is going to go the scientific route and say that, well, I can look at these brain waves of the 10 people and I can correlate between them saying they feel anxiety and the actual physical fact of what's going on neurologically and physiologically that they call anxiety. And what anxiety is not what's going on in here in the existential sense of how does it make me feel, how does it change the way I orient myself towards my life. No, for the logical positivist, it only means neuron A connects to neuron B, the electrical impulse travels at this speed. This has been sort of revitalized today with what has been called eliminative materialism, which is a sort of basically rebranded logical positivism. And Deleuze and Guattari do not like this at all, because it creates a sort of stultifying epistemological and indeed ontological position, because it doesn't take into account the difference between affect and materiality. And indeed, affect has primary ontological status. And any of this empirical material stuff is secondary. Now, what does this mean? Well, going back to the example of breasts, they say that there's a difference between the lived emotion of having breasts and the breasts themselves. So you look at this body part, the breasts. Even men have breasts, they're just small. You look at the body part that is the breast, and it has a material facticity about it. It is just there. And that has its own ontological category of materiality. But on the other hand, I associate very particular feelings with what it's like to have breasts. And if I was, for example, body dysmorphic, I might feel that, oh, I wish I had breasts, but I don't. Or maybe I'm a man with extremely enlarged breasts and I don't like them and I'm dysmorphic about them and I would like to have gynecomastia and have them cut off so that they feel normal. This affective feeling that we associate with the material thing is not in fact a question of referring to the material thing. There is a relationship, of course, between the material facts of the body and the affects and emotions that I associate with those material facts. But they're in fact two distinct ontological realms. If you try to find a one-to-one correspondence between the feeling of what it's like to feel these breasts, or have anxiety, or shock, or awe, or fear, you could not find a one-to-one correspondence between the affect and the material fact because they're ontologically different realms. They have something to do with one another, but they're not reducible to one another. And that is why Deleuze and Guattari are really pragmatists, essentially, because the pragmatists came to the logical positivists and charged them with reductionism. They reduced a particular domain they didn't like, namely the existential, the psychological. A lot of the eliminative materialists, the sort of modern reincarnation of logical positivism, for example, want to do away entirely with words like belief or feeling, because these are mirages. The only thing that's real is neuron A, neuron B, speeds, impulses, pressure, etc. These very physical and mathematical facts. These are what are true. They're what are really real. And the pragmatists, and indeed Deleuze and Guattari, step in at this point and say, really? Real? Okay, you're doing a kind of no true Scotsman here, where you're saying, well, we know you're saying this is real, but we don't actually think it's real. We only take this domain seriously, namely the physiological, neurological, etc. sort of positions. And Deleuze and Guattari do not want to, and they're taking this from Freud and Lacan, they do not want to minimize that register. Lacan places a lot of importance, just as Freud does, in phantasms, in illusions, in fantasies, in illusions and mirages. These are, in fact, important and key ways in which we interact with the world. And if we want to figure out what is this thing called me, called Gavin, or called whatever your name is, well, then you need to take these into account and not try to reduce them, because the logical positivists and all the representationalists who want to try to reduce the affective to the material are, one, and this is Deleuze and Guattari's point, making an ontological blunder, but two, they're actually just explaining away what makes us humans. It's an objectification of human life in the worst way possible, because it takes away the lived experience, which in fact is primary to the way I live my life. For example, when we go back to this example of the word book and the thing in my hand which it corresponds to, the means by which I represent it, namely language, or maybe I draw a painting that corresponds with this book, that is always secondary to the immediate and unmediated experience of what does it feel like to be in my hands? What kind of affects do I experience when I look at it or when I hear it slap my knee? These, and this is really both a Kantian and a Hegelian point, is that there is actually no mediation between the book as object of the mind and the interpreter who is interpreting what does it mean, the Dasein, or the subject, or whatever you want to call it. That, sure, Hegel will say, for example, that there is a difference between the book in itself and the book as object of the mind. Book as object of the mind has been filtered through the senses, and now it has an unmediated relationship to me that's thinking about it. I don't need to do some sort of representational process. Once it's in my head, once my sensations have done the filtering process, then at that point I have a direct affective and really bodily relationship. Hegel doesn't say bodily, but Deleuze and Guattari really want to stress that relationship to the book. So prior to me representing it, there is a lived experience, an emotion or an affect that goes along with the materiality of the book. So they want us to rethink objects such that they are associated with our desires and, in pragmatist fashion, with our goals, beliefs, and values. And by doing so, our goal is to get close to this burning center of the matter they speak of, the immediate objectivity of the object. This emotion, as Artaud says, situated outside of the particular point where the mind is searching for it. In other words, the emotion that I have of this is not reducible to me. It's different from me. It's something that I am feeling, but it's not me. And my entire soul flows into this emotion, the terribly disturbing sound of matter. And when he says sound of matter, Artaud is trying to point to the fact that, for example, what it sounds like for this book to hit my knee, there's no conscious representation that's going into the experiencing of that sound. Before I can decide how I feel about it or how I want to categorize it, what frequency I want to associate with it, or how it relates to the other things, there's an immediate experience of associating certain affects with that sound. So Artaud uses the idea of sound of matter here to discuss the immediate affective relationship to the materiality of bodily experience. And as such, I think this is a very important ontological category distinction to make when thinking about the difference between materiality and affect. I think this has a lot of important implications for how do we relate to our bodies. This is thus going to implicate queer and feminist theory. It's going to implicate cultural studies and how we think about the body's relationship to land and things like this. So I think that this very short passage really shows how Deleuze and Guattari really opened the floodgates for affect theory, for really implicating, as Rorty has said in one of his essays, that we cannot make a clear distinction between fact and value. Or as Heidegger puts it, the ontological and hermeneutical are implicated in one another and are inextricably related. That what something is and what it means are inextricably tied together, and that we do not have this separated relationship as subject from the world of objects, because the objects become directly implicated in our lived experience and tied up with what it means to be me. After all, right now, what it means to be me, Gavin, is to teach. It's to be associated with this book in a particular way that's different from the way that you associate with it as a viewer or as a reader of the same book, which is in fact not the same book, because this particular book is mine and not yours. So all of that is very important, and Deleuze and Guattari really bring it to the forefront in a really interesting, kind of funny analogy. So that being said, I hope that this has been helpful. I'm back at my house because I just finished my first semester of my sophomore year, so yay! Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I appreciate everyone who decides to be a benefactor to this channel. I appreciate you so much. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.